welcome to the second day of the Prague Micro Festival 2023. We have a great program for you tonight, as we did yesterday, and we're kicking off today with our traditional critical encounters panel. This has been going on for a few years, for a few iterations of the festival, and we basically try to get together some theorists, artists, poets, to speak about some of the things they do, and to maybe tease out some of the more critical aspects of contemporary poetics and discourse. So today, the panel is called Decolonizations, Art and Emancipation, and we'll be talking about the ways language and poetics play, or rather interact with colonization, decolonization, recolonization, and see where the discussion takes us. I will read just a bit of the abstract, and let me just say that all the information, I'll be very brief. I'll also be briefly introducing our eminent panelists, who are Milan Krowlik, Svetlana Matvienko, and Louis Armand, whom I will invite onto stage presently. I will read a bit of the text so that we get an idea of what we'll be talking about today. Considering the recent socio-political challenges, from the Russian Federation's aggressive war on the continent to the socio-economic precarity brought about by the ever more palpable climate change, the struggle of decolonization is developing within an increasingly accelerated world. This volatility engenders a pervasive zeitgeist of entropy and cultural crisis. If, to paraphrase media theorist Irit Rogoff, contemporary culture is moving towards an active engagement with the lived conditions of the present, how is such an engagement reflected in the very conditions of cultural and aesthetic production? How imperative is it for culture and art production to actively engage with politics and the conditions of its own colonization, or, conversely, what are the potential strategies of exit? Should cultural and aesthetic production facilitate its own decolonization, and to what ends? So these are some of the questions we'll be teasing out. Apart from our invited panelists who will be joining me here presently, we have a video presentation from Irmgard Emmelheins from Mexico City, who couldn't be here with us today, and we will play two videos. I will just give a brief introduction to Irmgard, who is a global scholar, writer, and professor based in Mexico City, who's currently a curatorial research fellow at the Blackwood Gallery in Canada, working on a book project and exhibition titled Good Brain One: Destructive Desires and Other Destinies of Excess. Irmgard Emmelheins.
Hi, this is Irmgard Emmelheins from Mexico City. Welcome to the Prague Micro Festival 2023, to the Critical Encounter. One of the things heavy in our minds right now is the current situation on the Gaza Strip, where attacks with unprecedented violence and rage are currently taking place. Humanitarian aid accumulates at the Egypt-Gaza border, and the much necessary help is being denied to the population in Gaza. Gazawis are thus living an intensified episode of the Nakba, or catastrophe, and the whole world is bearing witness to a campaign of disinformation. Half of the Gaza population has been subject to forced displacement, and the entire strip is undergoing total siege, which means no electricity, gas, water, food, painkillers, and hospitals. The Al-Ahli hospital was bombed on Tuesday. Israel has blamed the Islamic Jihad for the attack. I don't believe them. Over 500 people were killed. Hundreds remain amongst the rubble. The threat of ground invasion looms, and by the time Israel ceases fire, thousands will surely be dead, and the survivors will be suffering unimaginable ordeals. Meanwhile, detentions, killings, and confrontations in demonstrations and attacks by settlers and the Israeli army against the Palestinians in the West Bank are the order of the day. When thinking about the current events in Palestine, we should think that the prospect of precarity, displacement, incarceration, and imminent death in the midterm is the situation of a significant portion of the planetary population. Under the current post-pandemic stage of capitalism, techno-feudalism, Yanis Varoufakis has called it, the system is managing bodies that are no longer destined to be exploited as cheap labor through necropower. By necropower, I mean beyond biopolitics or power as allowing populations to live or to die, an extended notion of necropolitics, which means the creation and management of remainder lives trapped in loops of illness, lack of basic rights, or the basic to survive, slavery, debt, forced displacement, and death. Necropower has transformed descendants of colonized peoples and slaves from an exploitable labor force to a negative and undesirable mass, a redundant, or what Neferti X. M. Tadiar has called remainder populations, targeted for extermination and carceral management, destined to die migrating through subcontracted state violence or slow deaths through chronic inflammatory illness caused by excess and toxic substances. Social groups across the globe are structurally forced to occupy this state of expendability, causing massive waves of migration. We are talking about refuge detention centers in Australia, Mexico, El Salvador, and the US. Misery belts in Paris, Manila, or Sao Paulo. Urban workers' lodgings in China or special economic zones across Southeast Asia or Central America, or those trapped in the machinery of the corporate prison complex. The dead and disappeared in the war against drugs in the Philippines, Colombia, and Mexico. The wars in the Middle East. All these situations are the condition of possibility of wealth and power for the populations whose lives are produced as valuable to the system. The cost of valued life thriving in enclaves of privilege across the world, in other words, is the precarization and destruction of life produced as remaindered. This has led to injurious forms of interdependency at a planetary scale, which means the wasting and elimination of lives are necessary for the mournable lives of the citizens to thrive. For instance, the cost of cheap frozen fish available in European supermarkets is the elimination of native fisher populations around Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania, or forced displacement of certain communities, which means migration and most likely death for them, if there is lithium beneath their land, so we can have batteries in our cell phones and laptops. In this context, it is difficult to imagine what could be the conditions of decolonization. Coloniality remains invisible, present in the foods we eat, the clothes we wear, the medicines that cure us, media coverage. Coloniality means that there is a blind spot to colonization, a ghostly unseen or repressed side. Polarization, another form coloniality has taken, is invisibilizing the ordeal of people at the margins, managed as remaindered or redundant. And this is at work also, coloniality, on mass and social media, government, educational, and other kinds of institutions at a global scale. What does it mean to decolonize in this context? Even if art may help us to imagine a way to cognitively liberate ourselves from our current frames of thought deriving from Western anthropocentrism, I believe that a critique of theory and practice of decolonization is necessary, parting from the fact that in spite of the institutionalization of the decolonial perspective in academic and cultural production, and the ongoing discussion in Europe about restitution of colonial spoils, systemic forms of invisible coloniality remained unchallenged. The situation in Gaza attests to this, as well as the massive forced displacement of thousands of people from the global south to the north. What needs to be brought to the fore is what has been violently erased from history and what is specific to Western modernity. The current manifestations of imperialism, colonialism, genocide, world wars, and predation as a force and logic to relate to the world and to others. Contrary to what we believed in, the legacy of modernity resulted not in a horizon of emancipation led by the proletariat, but a biosphere and humanity at the verge of extinction, surviving, self-destructing in a world already in ruins. This is because modernity is inextricable from colonization, and both need to be thought in tandem as the two constitutive sides of the last 500 years of Western history. So, decolonization would mean for us, Europeans and the descendants of European occupiers, criollos, pieds noirs, settlers, the challenge of becoming unmodern. This implies minding the contemporary qualities of our data-driven culture in which life, capitalism, and cybernetics are inextricably intertwined. This culture is furthermore based on a technology of extraction. So to become unmodern means acknowledging the colonial roots of extractivism inherent to techno-feudal capitalism. To become unmodern, moreover, not only means to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, territorial defense movements, and against extractive mega projects, but to acknowledge that the nation state will never grant justice, reparation, citizenship for everyone, because it is immersed in capitalism. Finally, to become unmodern means imagining and creating a different world beyond this one. Thank you.
That was Imgard Amelhein's the first video, and now we will screen a second, shorter 3-minute video, which will deal with the conditions of language in coloniality, in decoloniality, and then I will invite our guests on stage. Thank you.
Hello everyone at the critical encounter of the Prague Micro Festival 2023. And this is a question I was asked related to my book, Toxic Loves. What role does writing have in this world of refugees, people barely surviving, and in which writing has been put at the service of the culture industry to entertain the privileged classes? When writing has the burden of performing superficial gestures of inclusion and democracy? When writing means monetizing self-exposure of our constitutive wounds? What does it mean to be a writer today when disinformation and propaganda reach the degree zero of the world? What is the place of intellectuals in a wordless place? As polysemy has been stolen, the meaning of words distorted, language expropriated from its quality of being a true descriptor of reality by power. According to Arundhati Roy, writers and readers build the site of writing together. A site that is extremely fragile yet indestructible because it is ceaselessly built like a refuge. Writing is like a trench that allows us to peep, dodge, and counterattack an invisible enemy that is penetrating and overwhelming, working us from within. Clearly, our present world is making an urgent call to intrinsically tie politics and writing, especially in a country, in Mexico, in which violence traverses the pores of all bodies, obliterating spaces of enunciation and living together, while a rhetoric of freedom of expression prevails as merchandise that coexist unproblematically with the ubiquity of state violence. I am living in a country, speaking from a country in which 11 women are murdered a day, and no one is charged for the murders. So, in this world, writing is a refuge and a trench to resist the closure of spaces for conspiring, writing stories, discussing, proposing alternatives, designing utopias, to collectively do reproductive labor, expose ideas, resist against the threat of the imposition of a certain should-be of culture and cultural politics. The problem that concerns us writers and readers, which we clearly share with activists and others dedicated to creation, is to find a balance between creativity and critical thinking, negativity and opposing consciousness. From a situated feminist position, acknowledging the intersectionality of feminist struggles, writing always means asking self-reflexively, where am I speaking from, about whom, and how? Part of the task of writing is to need to find strategies to maintain open relationships between ideas and practice, theory and activism, while being conscious that one does not necessarily precede the other. Specifically, Writing can help us think through means to resist the present, violence, the vulgarity of our times, and to express our anger and be worthy of our epoch, engaging with the present in an oppositional and productive way. Thank you.
That was Imgard Emmelheinz. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite our guests, Svetlana Matvienko, Louis Armand, and Milan Krolik, if you could take your place. And I will then briefly introduce them. We have Svetlana Matvienko, who is Associate Professor of Critical Media Analysis in the School of Communication of Simon Fraser University and Associate Director of the Digital Democracies Institute in Vancouver, Canada. Recently, she has written about Soviet and post-Soviet technopolitics, nuclear cultures, nuclear colonialism, and weaponization of energy infrastructure, focusing particularly on the Chernobyl and Zaporizhia nuclear power plants during the Russia-Ukraine war. She has recently co-authored the book Cyber War and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism from Minnesota University Press in 2019, and has received numerous accolades for her work. Next to Svetlana sits Louis Armand, who is a writer, artist, and theorist. He has published 2 works of criticism in this year, actually, Anthropology and Festens de Desmondo, both launched as part of the Prague Micro Festival, and as well as the poetry collection Diode, also launched as part of the Micro Lab, which I invite you all to maybe take a stroll down the stairs and see where the past 3 weeks of PMF Micro Lab has ended up. There's some great artwork and zines and also a bookshop I invite you to see. He is director of the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory at Charles University Prague, and we have Milan Krolik, who is a post-humanities researcher, Université Toulouse and Charles University in Prague, photographer and novelist to be. He publishes on image thought via anthropology, cinema, media theory, and philosophy, and empirically experiments with technology and ritual, especially against Buddhist worldlings. Now, my first question will be to Milan, and I think it's interesting to sort of regard language, as Irmgard has told us in the second video, as a type of mechanism, as a mode of generating perhaps potential alternatives. You recently wrote Sensory Speculations at the Height of Summer, published at 34.sk magazine, where you actually engaged with just this kind of approach to language as a generative, emergent phenomenon, something which can generate different futures, can generate alternatives and concepts, not perhaps habitually assumed. So could you maybe tell us a few words about how you see that relationship between speculation and language?
Okay, does it work? Does it work? Yep. No. No? Yes? Okay, thanks. So I think one of the important things to think when thinking with language and poetics is that not language as a descriptor, as something that could eventually fully grasp the world, as something separate from the world through that. That is already colonial to me, but as something that is co-productive of the world, and not world in general, but always in a specific space. But it also does something, as everything does something, so language can point to somewhere, make something else possible. It's not just a descriptor or a utopia. Even like utopian texts, utopian imaginings have some effects that are not necessarily what was intended. And I think, or like one of the things that really influenced me, or like changed my ways of thinking about languages, James C. Scott's the anthropologist, the anarchist anthropologist who works in Southeast Asia, this region he calls Zomia, in these like highlands where a lot of communities refuse language. They used to write, and writing, not language of course, whatever language might be, but they refuse writing because writing of course at some level externalizes a memory. Through that hierarchy can appear something like stable, something where we can point to in order to support our position, whereas where not this kind of memory exists, and some ways a freer or more equal society can become. So of course, writing as to everything in the world has different effects, and one of the, for me, to decolonize is important to get away from this idea, from this continually operating image that we have from Christianity, that there is a kind of not just a finished world, but a true world, right? I'm Nietzschean, obviously, here. But to really situate ourselves like within and see what it does and see what we can connect things with. And then also start to cultivate ours and the people around us, or bodies, or whoever, whatever entity we try to communicate with, to cultivate our attention and bodily habits in a way that break these habitual connections that we have, that we are taught as new, normal and natural, through say meditation techniques or other techniques that we have that do exist in the West, though usually they're connected to some things that not everybody would want to dabble in. So this process for me of decolonization already starts before even language begins. And to start working with language as something material, and writing, of course, and that's figuring out what it does and trying to come up with new ways of organizing what even writing could be outside of a representational model, and not just critique it, but actively build and work with it. And that includes, of course, work on ourselves, and that's also what I was trying to develop in that text, to the sensory speculation. Usually we have speculative realism and different kinds of speculations, but I wanted to, through my experience with Buddhist things and others, is that there is already a speculative element in the seemingly immediate, unmediated becoming of a body, because I observing myself through different techniques and learning to see what's happening to me and what affects me and how I can maybe navigate that without being totally overcome, determined by the world as it has been built, European colonial theories becoming naturalized in the world and everywhere, so they seem to be self-evident. So what I learned analyzing myself and talking with people, of course, about it is that I'm often not even aware of how my perception of things changes, and that means also a biological, to some degree, biological constitution of my perceptive apparatus changes, and then develop some ways of hacking that, of putting it maybe in some other direction, and the same thing can be done with language, and what that has helped me to see is actually also the poetic in terms of creative force of language, because the moment and I encounter something that has not been put into words, a problem in my own reality, and I have that with people who are not philosophers, my friends I hang out with, and they of course have issues that have not really put into words, at least they haven't read anywhere, and then all of a sudden they feel the power of language as a creative tool. But that can only happen once the resistances of other bodies and materiality are kind of explored. And for me that would be an important part of decolonization, because otherwise, frankly, for me it's all just projection of us privileged people having enough time to think and write in ways that are based on the model of a sitting person writing and thinking, but there are different kinds of thinking, and a lot of academics forget that, because we're the way the world is organized is we're not really made to go out and live, right? We're made to sit and think, and I find it important for any decolonization not look elsewhere maybe then look for inspiration when things break down, but to kind of push whatever one is in, whatever conditions one is in such a direction that that it fragments and certainty breaks down. And I'm of course here working with Deleuze's first cinema book, applying it to kind of anthropologically. So that's kind of my contribution now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. It seems that I really like this connection that you made. Where if this notion of that the personal is political, we sort of see that the political language is personal language, and vice versa. And this points. This gets to my second question. It would be to Louis Armand. Recently, I read one of your pieces, Language of the Unspeakable, which is available at the Alienist Manifesto website, where you actually deal with just such a relationship. Where, as far as I understood it, you try to question on particular contemporary case studies in the Ukraine, for example, the June of this year, the assassination of Victoria Amalina in Kramatorsk by an Iskander missile. And where you actually, as far as I understand it, again, introduce this political aspect to language, which is at the same time engaging with the personal. You go back to Plato's Republic, where, you know, obviously the poets were banished from the perfect state, from a type of sort of techno-fascist utopia in a way. And I'm wondering where you would situate this discourse. To what degree is political language personal language, and where is again this idea of imaginative, speculative poetics in that?
I'm thinking about the previous comments about the idea of the new. You know, there's a passage in the Bible. It's a messianic passage about the next coming of the Messiah, in which he's going to make all things new. He's going to make all things new. And it's a messianism that creeps its way through Deleuze and Guattari in particular, with 1,000 Plateaus, with this mantra about new concepts, making new concepts. And somehow in this discourse we lose sight of the fact that making new, pushing into new territories and occupying them and incorporating them into a discourse is colonization, is colonialism. And we need to be aware of the very easy rhetorical turn into making a distinction between novelty or some avant cultural gestures and some easy decolonial gesture. The two cannot be actually separated. The personal and the political as a mantra. Do we need to keep talking personal? Maybe we could talk about narcissism. Why do we care? Why should we constantly make recourse to what is really, again, a return just by other means to individualism, which has been the central kind of red herring of neoliberalism, and center a notion of the political on this? This seems to be an acquiescence to the wrong kinds of terms and to completely sabotage any kind of political attempt to theorize the political or any political discourse in advance. I was a little bit interested actually in what Irmgard had to say. She introduced her talk the first video, as you remember, referring to the situation in Gaza and then generalizing onto other situations that we're all familiar with in terms of forced immigration and so on, and a reference again to the idea that there is a privileged community, a privileged segment of the global economy, or a privileged class in some sense. And while not disputing really any of the observations that she made, okay, controversy, the idea that there's some kind of machination or mechanism behind this, i.e. some kind of rationalism, that these circumstances exist because there's basically a global plan and it advances the interests of some mechanism that we call global capital. I think it's a question that has been under scrutiny for some time because of the persistence of the notion of class that was the central tenet of so much so-called Marxist critique, and that has persisted in a lot of left-wing thinking up until the present. The idea of class solidarity is some kind of almost nativism, some almost eugenic notion of being belonging to a class by birth or by virtue of being in some kind of economic pay bracket or some kind of demography. has been really demystified by the whole history of public relations and marketing and so on and so forth. It has shown the rationalism that infuses the way in which people identify, their notion of selfhood in the way that they consume and participate, whether you call it politically or in the economy and so on and so forth. And I wonder to what extent that irrationalism can be projected onto the way in which we see this, let's say, global situation in which there are episodes everywhere of forced migration, detention, and so on and so forth that seems to reaffirm and indeed reify some notion of privilege, and yet that this privilege, which is often supported as a concept by reference to these external factors, is at the same time subverted by the fact that within these privileged communities, if you like, or conceptual affinity groups, is somewhat fictional, is somewhat imaginary, fantastical. And I think that, for example, the reference to academia is a very good example. I don't really perceive that there is any such thing as an ivory tower in which philosophy and whatnot is going on, not so much just distinct from the world, but that real economic circumstances that would affect the apparently ordinary person does not translate into academia. I think this is a maintained fallacy, a kind of distinction, because what we've seen is really the kinds of privileges that we identify as those things that say artists are somehow privileged, poets are somehow privileged, intellectuals are privileged, and so on and so forth. This is really a travesty. The kind of economic foundation for this notion of privilege just doesn't really exist. At the same time, considering them to be privileged disarms them to say, oh, we can't really comment on this, that, and the other because we don't have the legitimacy of being of the working class, being of the proletariat, or being something along these lines. This old notion of a bad conscience, the intellectual versus the worker on the street. Anyway, I don't want to really go on about that, but I think it's something that we need to keep in mind, the internally fractured nature of this apparently privileged society. And I think that we see it in the phenomenon of people like Donald Trump, the notion that there's some rational explanation for why certain segments of the community are going to support and participate in and apparently do this without any cynicism or delusions or whatnot, and be supportive of certain sort of ideas that from a perspective of the apparently sort of rational segment of society is somehow nonsensical. You know, these kinds of explanatory models have broken down. I think that it's something we need to keep in mind.
I see, am I on? No? One, two, one, two, one, two, test. Oop. Yes, I hear myself. I appreciate the comment, Louis. I'm kind of wondering, because obviously you're currently speaking, or you were speaking from a type of critical, theoretical perspective, but obviously you're also a poet. And I'm just wondering, because if we take Irmgard's statement that there is this convergence of politics and language, which politics she associates with the workings of, let's say, contemporary semio-capitalism, and you say that novelty is in itself colonial, I'm just wondering, where do you find value in poetics? Because you're obviously active. Where would you situate a valid, a relevant poetics?
I'm so looking forward to what Svetlana has to say.
Okay, that's kind of too bad, I have to say, because again, with Irmgard saying that you know, there's this need to be subjectivized, I guess, for her. Thank you very much. I will ask Svetlana now. Svetlana, you just came from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. You devote a large part of your work to nuclear colonialism, to post-Soviet politics. I'm wondering, could you give us a bit of an overview of what exactly you were doing in Chernobyl and some of the outcomes of that research?
Thanks for the question. And actually, because listening to my co-panelist, I also have something to say in regard to actually language per se, which I will do in the end. But I will begin with what you're asking and to share a couple of things about my research, the trip to Chernobyl and the current situation in Ukraine. So, which is extremely difficult at the moment, and I think one of the major acts of solidarity, which we do not see very much, is mentioning all wars in one line. Somehow our attention is shifting, just like it always does in capitalism, just like it was trained in capitalism. But I think it's very important to have a broader context kind of together and seeing potential ways to solidarize. So that's a general comment. Now about Chernobyl. So as probably many of you are familiar and know that the occupation of the Chernobyl zone was one of the initial acts of the invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine in February 22. And of course, there were other points of entrance, but the occupation of the sites of nuclear infrastructure was quite important and remains important in this war. It has to do with the weaponization of the infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure, making it actually a tool for informational pressure, but also for very real physical pressure that has to do with the potential, in fact, of an explosion, but it also has to do with a lot of horrific practices related to torture of the workers associated with different scenes and on the occupied sites and territories. When I focused my research, this is for the context, but I focused my research on the Chernobyl zone, which I started researching since 2016 and have been there many, many times. And I have been there twice after deoccupation, one time in July and most recently 5 days ago. And when we speak about language as a tool, I use radiation as a tool to unpack the colonial history and certain colonial trace which is used almost as a root for the invasion, occupation, and certain acts in this war. And when I speak about radiation as a tool, I'm from a media theory. I teach in the School of Communication. So I read radiation as a medium. And there was a time in 1986 when radiation became a mass medium, right? So that's when, after the explosion, after the catastrophe, despite all the efforts to contain the information by the Soviet government, radiation was that medium that traveled westward and made the world global before the internet. So that was the day, right? So when radiation became a mass medium. But I use a medium in a little different way in my research. I see radiation as elemental medium, which is a kind of a very interesting discourse in the media theory recently on the intersection of environmental studies and media theory, when you actually think about politics of water or air or pollution, all those material things that in fact mediate, that in fact kind of create the differences, that enact power and other things. And I think seeing what those materialities in the context and through the frameworks of media theory is very important. So when you take radiation as an elemental media, suddenly you see how the Chernobyl zone was produced way before 1986. It was actually produced from the beginning of construction of the nuclear power plant, and almost simultaneous construction of another Cold War thing, which was the Duga radar, right? So right there, it was Chernobyl too, very close to this. It's not coincidental that these two Cold War objects kind of were existing there. They marked the territory. They kind of, made this area securitized, and the Soviets imposed a particular regime of militarization and securitization on that area that several decades later became the Chernobyl zone. So the leaks were happening for 20 years, literally, right? So the securitization and military colonization of Ukrainian police happened in the early 70s. And then, coincidentally, quote unquote, we have the Chernobyl zone. So, and Paul Virilio, for instance, one of the philosophers with whom I often engage in my research, likes to speak about 1986, at that year, that revealed to us the meaning of the modern technology, the top of which is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And when I engage with Virilio in my research, and knowing that Virilio was not at all interested in any colonial, decolonial, or other discourses, obviously, but bringing them in conversation, right? So asking this question about coloniality, about power. So I actually say that this revelation about what the nuclear power and Cold War kind of relation is, so we see it in 2022. We see it not as we really saw it in 1986, but we see it in 2022 with this occupation of the nuclear power infrastructure and weaponization it so fast in this war actually tells us a lot what colonialism, modernity, technology, nuclear power are together. All this kind of very problematic assemblage. And that's what I have to say on this matter. But if I may just use 2 more minutes, I also say a couple of words about language. And as many in Ukraine during this time, I happened to be in Ukraine before the invasion, and so was observing the situation from a relatively safe place in the southwest of Ukraine, where there were no hits, but there was still this kind of terror environment created. So I was fascinated by this mobilization of the national effort to document, to create all sort of records of what is happening. And of course, we've been so many times kind of, our memory was stolen, destroyed, rewritten, etc. So in a certain way, it was that kind of resistance to document in all sort of forms. I mean, I wasn't surprised when writers like Luba, who is here in the audience, wrote about war, or when journalists did so. But I was still very much surprised when some sort of fashion bloggers, right? So those who were interviewed Russian stars, literally like 3 years ago, suddenly switched to document people kind of stories, traumas, experiences, going almost to the front lines and just film, record, and produce with this material. And of course, we all were also engaged in consumption of this material, immediately watching and reading also many things that were brought immediately to us, many of them absolutely horrific. And then I noticed this very interesting kind of thing there, that no matter how much it was difficult to watch and traumatizing, we could not, and I spoke to other people too, this is kind of shared experience, we could not remove ourselves from watching this, from reading about this. And that's where I literally felt there was something kind of a quality of, this labor, the labor of knowing, of producing this knowledge, the labor where we could not remove ourselves from learning. Learning kind of the extent of violence that are applied to the citizens, the extent of, certain horrors that someone experienced, to know just to continue live. And then I started thinking that I saw so many people were writing again about this. And for myself, I was also writing. I also wrote, as many people, a war diary, which I'm preparing to publication now. But that was about this. Then I thought, what is the meaning of this language, right? So what this language does. So it labors to witness. And that's kind of like the notion that I sort of came up with in this particular context, was the labor of witnessing. And it directly has to do with language. Because one thing is to see, and then I realized a very different thing is to find the words for that. Right? So to what extent and when and how a testimony, right? So, or witnessing something becomes a testimony, right? So, or then evidence of something. And we constantly are dealing now with massive cases sent to the International Criminal Court, right? So genocidal, ecocidal, and whatnot, right? So I constantly think about the meaning of language in what these transitions from experiencing, seeing, to saying, to putting it in words, and then making it an evidence.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. I will take the opportunity to invite all of you to actually witness some of the zines which are below, which have been brought from Lviv by Alexandra. And there's actually explicit testimonies in them via the medium of comic book, for example, from Berdyansk, or a sort of a retrospective of the places in Mariupol which are no longer simply in existence, and many other testimonies. I sincerely recommend you visit the stall. It's just down the stairs, and there you can find it. I would like to open the floor now to any questions from the audience, comments, provocations. Might anybody have something to say? Michael, please.
The pretty little ripples, huh? I think this is something that is, again, it's an old trope, right? I mean, Hegel talks about the master and the slave and the different consciousness that can be attributed to both of these, or the colonizer and the colonized subject. And the colonized always speak their own language and the language of the colonizer, so to speak, right? And this is something you're embedded in, and you're aware of this. And I think that whenever you come to this question of language, especially if you externalize it in some sense, whether it's as a tool or as something that belongs to another, that its real language is received pronunciation, blah, 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 English, Oxford English Dictionary, this kind of thing. This is something you're constantly aware of every time that you enter into any kind of, all the time. There's no entering into. You're constituted in this situation. So I think that it's somehow inherent to the situation. But then, as soon as you say something like that, you have the problem of, okay, so you have again a privileged position. So the colonizer is somehow not in this kind of situation. So what they have to go through some process of education or whatnot when they approach language, and they're somewhat oblivious. I think this comes back to what I was saying before about this fantastic notion of privilege. Really, the colonization, it's like the tortoises, it's colonization all the way down. There's really no privileged subject. There is simply the fantasy of being the privileged subject, and in a sense that sublimation or denial of being colonized. That somehow colonization is something that happens to somebody else somewhere else. And there's that aspect of language, or not so much a language, but of a literature, particularly capital L literature, and you encounter this attitude structured into the notion of the institution of literature. And you encounter this notion of privilege built into that, and it's ideologically encoded, but it's not the situation of language, because language is not something that is subject to sovereignty. That's again this the fantasy that meaning can be constrained, and we all know that this is a fiction too. It's part and parcel of that rationalist notion that language can be put to work, that it's merely a tool and it can be orientated towards some particular end, whether it's revolutionary or whether it's exploitative and so on and so forth. And by various means we can constrain and limit and prohibit and whatnot various unsatisfactory or undesirable significations. And we know there are regimes of power that attempt to do that, and they're very real, and the consequences of their actions are very real, and their experience is very real by the people who bear the consequences of it. But we know at the end of the day that these regimes of power may cause misery and a great deal of harm, but they do not actually restrict language. Language isn't ultimately restricted by any of these things. So I think that when we talk about anti-colonialism or decolonialism or some acolonialism, this is already the condition of language, and the fiction is that it can be, as it were, colonized, constrained, territorialized in a particular way. And that's one of the things I was alluding to when I said this notion of the new. We have to always be cautious of what we mean by the new, that the dynamic of pushing into a zone and contesting or breaking against, attempting to break those constraints and whatnot. This is inherently an aggressive, militant, violent act. We can't pretend otherwise. There's no avant-garde by consensus. There's no decolonization by consensus. And then the question is to what extent in the process of this we accede to being colonizers, or we attend to the subversions and so on and so forth, the difficult tasks of avoiding, repeating or reiterating the abuses and attempts to control discourse and so on and so forth. It's always a vexed problem, perhaps inescapable.
I'd like to maybe, in these brief 5 minutes we still have, come back to this simple statement made by Irmgard that coloniality is invisible. And I'll actually address two questions. It's kind of the same question, both to Milan and to Svetlana. We can start with Svetlana. It's a very simple question. I'm wondering, what are the politics of the Russian language currently in the Ukraine? How valid is it to use it? In what context? What would you say?
There are still so many people speak Russian, but of course, as an act of resistance now, there was huge turn to Ukrainian language. So people were learning Ukrainian after the invasion, actually, even those who all life spoke Russian, right? So I speak Russian with my mother, for instance. I speak English with my sister who lives in Chicago. I speak Ukrainian to everyone I know in Ukraine, right? So I didn't switch to Ukrainian with my mother. I keep speaking Russian with her. She is 85. Yeah, and but that's one of the myths, of course, that was absolutely mobilized and used in all sort of disinformation frameworks during this war, right? But I also find it's quite interesting, the whole claim. So, I mean, something to be researched soon, later, or now. In fact, why language still acts or still can be used as a claim for, quote unquote, saving someone, or occupation, right? So what does it even mean that language is that marker that someone, like an empire maybe, right? So acts as an invader, right? So I was particularly kind of, not to say intrigued, by tasked to think about that, right? So the meaning of language in modernity, the meaning of modern empires, the behavior of modern empires and modern politics, and that language was kind of an understandable technology to weaponize in this war.
And if I could ask, Milan, you sort of also talked about that coloniality is invisible on the level of concepts, and I'm wondering what are some of the methods or mechanism for you personally to, in a way, decolonize language, to grapple with this invisible coloniality of language, to discern it, and to do what?
Since I do a lot of anthropology and some. So what I find enriching is to learn languages, at least one, try to learn. Don't have to be good. I never became good at Japanese or Thai, but like something that works really radically differently. And while doing linguistics too, and all of a sudden one starts seeing all of these regularities that are just assumed to exist, to be natural for every language. And how they could be different, and the thing is, it's not just to say, oh yeah, right, this language works differently, this society works differently, but which is done a lot, and then the theory goes on as if nothing changed, but to have these like feedback to transform that, or to be like, okay, so maybe no theories are ever universal, maybe they're just like tools that actually do something, and we could start thinking about like, what do these tools do? Who do they privilege? Who do they not privilege? What do they erase? What do they not erase? Because again, I know there is nothing universalism is or at least this projective one, where there's like one world is a very specific historical formation that is just like assumed, and I find that to be important to stabilize through these really practical encounters. So one of it with language, one of it is just to really try to learn something that works very different, and then read up on the history of like how. I always say Western, not like in the colonial sense, just because that's the history of the ways of acquiring this other language that I would go into, because I learned anything through English, to kind of be aware of that, see these like different paths that it could have taken, didn't take. And the other thing is, again, as an anthropologist, and because I work in Southeast Asia, or worked at least, all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, but people there were always speaking many languages. All of a sudden ethnicity and language don't really overlap that much. There is no like original mother tongue. Well, by now, again, they were created through the creation of modern nation states, and even the ones that were not colonized, like Thailand, had to institute a lot of things to kind of be able to tell colonial powers, no, we're modern, including changing basically everything. So then also to untangle or disentangle, or even like violently tear apart, because the violence is all the time. There is no world without violence. That's again a utopian fantasy. The question is, how much violence? Which directions does it go? And like, what tools can we develop to heal? Because oppressing violence to make it go away is just another violent act, of course. So to disentangle these things that we're just taught through hundreds of years of development of the colonial system that is naturalized as like world out there, and to find these things where fragmentations or frictions, right, to go with Anna Singh, where things like don't fit, which is also what I was saying before about this activity is like in the immediate world, whatever that means. That will be something for everybody to discern for themselves. But the thing is, right, once we become more conscious of these things, all of a sudden we start seeing, even in everywhere, that things don't actually fit, and we're used to ignoring that. Some people, for some, it's harder to ignore because they're actually in a less privileged position, which on some level makes it more privileged to become different, of course. So so my privilege doesn't have to be money, right? I mean, it can be all kinds of things. It's more like access, or like the difficulty one faces every day of whether you are or are not accepted. And I know we're different because I grew up as a non-local, and I was reminded every day, and as a worse non-local, it's, you're just reminded that you're kind of subhuman every day, right? So I know there is privilege because some people are afforded, like men also compared to women, are afforded to just like feel that the world belongs to them, and others are like not, right? So that's this, what Fanon and people wrote about is this continual violence that there is. On the other hand, when the things don't line up, it's easier to find something else, to build something else. And I think that people like that, we are like much stronger because we're used to things not actually working out. So the chasm that opens up between our self-image, the image of the world, and then like the world developing independently kind of our, what we were brought up in, becomes a real issue for like white men because it's totally different than what was said, and there are no tools to actually bridge this chasm and transform. So of course, in that sense, it's actually not, of course, a privilege, and through that comes another kind of violence. So with this, to come back to language, I find it useful again, I find it important to do like real, like practical material work, not as a processual thing, not in terms of like, I'm going to get good at this language and go to Japan and then I'm gonna be, the king there. It's like to just learn things, be in the process and see, what it practices, what it does, what it opens up, that it could be different. Because there is no correct, but there's definitely wrong. And I find that something that can be learned. But again, like through the materiality and its frictions.
Thank you very much.
Can I just very briefly, I know we are running out of time, but listening to Louis and Milan, I also thought that I agree with phantasmatic nature of some privileges, or privilege as something solid or complete. But I would still support you, Milan, saying that there is privilege, right? So, and for me, privilege is relational. And if we see privilege as relational, as suddenly comes up as a result of particular relations, right? So suddenly privilege is the acknowledgement of inequality, right? So different positions, different powers, etc. And suddenly but you are completely right? So there's no like complete, right? So it's all this completeness that is a phantasmatic thing. But as soon as we take it as relational, so that suddenly sometimes it's very invisible, but becomes very visible if you actually understand what those relations are and who is privileged there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If there are no immediate questions, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our guests. From my left, Louis Armand, Svetlana Matvienko, and Milan Krolik. And we have an hour of live readings for you, so please stay with us, get a drink, and again, I invite you to take a look downstairs at in the cellar. So thank you very much, and have a good night.